Other things going on around this period was the recognition that society was hampered by alcoholism. The easy access to alcohol, liquor stores, the immediate availability, bars, any places like that, or the perhaps even availability of grain to manufacture alcohol on your own, made alcoholism rampant, especially if people had a little bit extra money. There were people in the progressive movement around this era that recognized that, wow, alcoholism is affecting a huge amount of our population. It's ruining marriages, it's ruining relationships, it's ruining jobs. Production is affected by it because people were hungover or maybe even drunk on the job. Uh, Physical abuse is up. There are all kinds of different things that began around this period to curb the idea of alcoholism. And eventually it would lead to a curbing of immigration. We're going to talk about that in a second. But during this period, a heavy evangelical influence emerged, especially from the Women's Christian Temperance Union, um, to espouse the idea of temperance, which is the reduction, if not the overall elimination, of alcohol. And in doing so, you're going to improve society, you're going to eliminate drunkenness, you're going to improve working conditions, you're going to improve productivity, and you're going to break apart some of the sinister type aspects that alcohol allows. So you're more likely to have alcoholism also when you have larger groups of people, your cities. So not only are you going to have more concentrations in a particular area, but there's going to be more of them. You're going to have more conflict. You're going to have more fights, more abuses, all kinds of different things. So these various different temperance movements sought political action to do something about alcoholism. Eventually, their work would produce the idea that the United States should prohibit all sales of alcohol. And eventually, it would take until after the First World War, but by 1920, the 18th Amendment was passed, which banned alcohol. So, a complete prohibition and manufacture of alcoholic beverages is what the 18th Amendment calls for. Okay? We're going to talk about in the next chapter about just exactly what happens with the prohibition movement. It's kind of like today's modern war on drugs. And we talk about this in my lecture classes and have group discussions about it. Should certain drugs today be considered legal and perhaps regulated by various different state and other government authorities and taxed, like what you see with marijuana, for example? Marijuana is legal in a number of different states, Colorado being the first, and it is taxed. So you have licensed dispensaries, if you will, where you can legally purchase marijuana and proceeds can be taxed, and that increases revenue for the state. There are mixed reviews based on the states that allow for marijuana consumption, and I'm not going to go into a greater conversation or detail about that. However, that's possibly something to consider is that, wow, if marijuana were not legal, the demand for marijuana would not go away, and the illegal activity, especially by way of cartels, would just be enhanced. That being said, as well, marijuana is often lauded as the gateway drug. So you're going to smoke weed and then you're going to perhaps be introduced to harder drugs like cocaine or heroin or meth, something like that. Okay, so I can see both sides to the argument. But marijuana itself, its effects aren't really any different than consumption of alcohol, and in many cases they're less severe. So, okay, many states have gone to deregulate, or rather to decriminalize marijuana. Even states like Texas to this day, certain amounts are not going to be arrestable if that makes sense. You might get fined for having a joint or something like that. Okay? I don't smoke. I don't know what many of the procedures are, but um, I know it's a growing movement in the United States, pardon the pun, that has restricted or a lot of the movement for marijuana illegally. Okay? But otherwise, though, there are people that have the idea that alcohol is a huge problem. What is also a huge problem in a lot of people's eyes is immigration. You have folks who see all these Southern and Eastern European immigrants coming to the United States, and they are polluting the gene pool, if that makes sense. See, back in this era, there used to be like your state fair or your county fair, and there would be like competitions for the most beautiful family, the most beautiful husband and wife, and their children are just lovely with blonde curly hair and perfect blue eyes, and they're just so attractive and white, and they're just good looking people, and they're muscular and they're fit. These are people that should reproduce. These are good looking people who are also intelligent and reasonable, and they're good natured, and they are physically fit, and they are able. And these Eastern Europeans come in, and they're like mongoloids, and they have big noses, and their whiteness is very different about them, and they're bringing all these like mental ailments and differences, and they speak weird languages, and oh my gosh, they look kind of deformed. They're mongoloids. That's polluting our gene pool. We can't have that. There were a number of different things that led to a fear of Eastern and Southern European immigrants. One, yeah, they're white, but they're different kind of white. They don't look like your traditional Western or Northern Europeans. They certainly don't sound like them either. And oftentimes, with immigration, especially in that era, you listen to the rhetoric of the Statue of Liberty, give me your poor, give me your downtrodden, that sort of a thing. Well, that's what you get. And in that era, you have people from the lowest rung of Eastern and Southern European society who are just looking for a new way in life in the United States and maybe go back to their home country after they've made something of themselves. But oftentimes you have people who are desperate and they're not the healthiest, or they're not the quote-unquote most intellectual or academic. So you have folks that are coming to the United States who are in desperate situations, and oftentimes it is people who have perhaps a disability, or maybe they have mental issues, bipolarism, depression, ADHD, all the kind of isms that you hear today. A lot of these immigrants came to the country with. And then you add to the fact that they're white, but they're not really white, and they're religious, but they're not Christian, or they're not the right type of Christian. Some of them have these weird anarchist ideologies. We can't have that. There were people who realized, okay, these immigrants are changing the face of our country, literally and figuratively speaking, and that's not good. And of course, we want to promote the most fit. We want to promote the smartest people, who are also the most attractive people, who are fit. They should reproduce. They should be encouraged to have larger families because they are more attractive and more fit and more intelligent. In reality, you saw a lot of these poor immigrants actually have more and more children as well. And there were people who realized these people that we don't like quite as much are breeding way faster than we are, and that's not a good thing. We got to do something about this. And so this whole movement began in the progressive era, centering around the idea of eugenics. Okay? So eugenics was actually a science that could alter various different plants to produce different hybrids, cross genes, seedless watermelon, seedless grapes, that sort of a thing. And the idea was you could mix and match some of the plant genetics to produce a better crop. People took that idea and espoused it towards human beings. You can kind of mix and match, and you can produce a better human being. And if more attractive people and stronger and fit people who are smarter and whiter breed, then all the better. We'll be better for it, right? Well, these Eastern and Southern Europeans are coming in and they're polluting the gene pool, and we're not getting as good a crop, so to speak. The idea of eugenics was meant to curb the idea of the pollution of America's racial stock. Okay? And it became a very sinister movement because it was deemed as a way to curb immigration and immigrant influence, not just racially, but economically as well, in many different ways. There were review boards in this era of American history that came up with various different clinical names for various different ailments. If you've ever heard of the word imbecile, somebody who is an idiot, somebody who you have all kinds of different names. You can actually look them up. They're clinical. These are medicinal clinical names for people. Somebody is literally an imbecile. Okay? That was actually a name. If somebody was categorized a certain way from a medical practitioner, that's their label. They may even be sent to an institution. During this era, over 11,000 Americans were forcefully sterilized by the United States government. I want you to listen to that again. During this era in American history, over 11,000 Americans were forcefully sterilized under the authority of the United States government. The United States government was physically preventing people from reproducing because they were deemed as being toxic to America's genetic pool. We talk about slavery, discrimination, treatment of Native Americans. That's one of the hidden wrongs of American history as well. The eugenics movement, which targeted specifics about who is better and for what reason they're better. And a government that could force you into sterilization, and you can figure what that might be like for men. That is a terrible, terrible government action. And it leads a lot of people to eventually realize government can get way out of control. If they're going to force sterilization, that's going to be a really big issue. There were others around this time who, under the guise of having compassion for women who are chronically pregnant, i.e. poor immigrant women, we want to provide them birth control so that they don't reproduce. This is where the advent of Planned Parenthood comes into play with Margaret Sanger, who was the basic founder of modern-day Planned Parenthood. Her noble idea of ending chronic pregnancy may be noble. However, Margaret Sanger is unquestionably, and if you go into any of her writings, including one of the novels that she wrote, she was a eugenicist who heavily criticized immigration. She was biased against all these immigrants coming in and polluting the gene pool. Okay, so Margaret Sanger may have had the noble idea of helping women end chronic pregnancy, but she was also a racist, a eugenicist, and she was an anti-immigrant, a xenophobe. Okay? Just keep that in mind. I want you to research that. That's not really up for debate either. There are people, no, she wouldn't. No. Look at her readings. That's not up for interpretation. That's pretty awful. Okay? Otherwise, though, there were people in this era who had the idea that this growing movement in Europe called socialism, with a Marxist influence where you basically eliminate the idea of capitalism and private property, could reorganize society. There was a growing movement of people in this country that espoused that, and you even had political candidates running for presidency under the guise of being a socialist. Loyalties were pretty much substantial, most in immigrant type communities who were trying to make it. Okay? Ultimately, socialists in this era fell by the wayside because they did not support America's entry into World War I. We're going to talk about that here after a little while. So they didn't support World War I. Um, Even if they were anti-radical, some of the more moderate socialists who wanted to kind of balance progress with enough capitalism to keep economic progress also in motion, even they were not sought after very well. Okay, so the socialist movement and the dream thereof somewhat starts and kind of fizzles a little bit. But then you also have the idea of deregulation. So there were folks in this era who believed in the idea that, yeah, some companies can get way too big and they might merge with another company and make that company in combination just this huge monopoly that's manipulating the market. We've got to do something about that. There are people who recognize that there are some companies that are going to wield too big of a stick and they're going to be too powerful. Okay? And so the government, progressives argued, should be able to regulate corporate growth, not eliminate it, and not eliminate private ownership or capitalism, but just at least provide some boundaries to keep things from getting overly large and out of control. So it was during this movement that you began to see some sort of decentralization between good trusts and bad trusts, trusts that produce more of an efficient product, that encourage innovation, that encourage competition, which makes things better for the consumer, and ultimately makes the companies better themselves because they're innovating. So it was during this era that you began to see some decentralization and regulation. But otherwise, though, this is an interesting era where people were looking at curbing alcoholism, curbing immigration, and population growth from there, and then also decentralization.